Imagine being the most dominant heavyweight MMA fighter in all of Europe. You've held a major promotional title for over 6 years and you haven't lost a fight since 2017. You walk out into sold out stadiums with thousands of people cheering your name. But then, when you fly home to the UK, walk down the street in Sunderland, and absolutely nobody knows who you are. That's the reality for Phil De Vries. Welcome to The Fight with Tom White. Today, we're looking at the heavyweight king of KSW, Poland's premier MMA organisation, and one of the biggest and most respected in the whole world. As of July 2026, he's defended his belt in KSW 14 times in a row, building one of the craziest dynasties in regional MMA history. He's dismantled an entire generation of heavyweights, from former champs to UFC veterans. But crazily, outside of very hardcore MMA circles in the UK, he's pretty much unknown in his own country. To understand why, you can't just look at his highlight reel. You have to look at one of the darkest, most intense psychological turnarounds in combat sports history, in my opinion. Because the Phil De Vries dominating Europe today is not the same guy who first stepped into the cage all those years ago. So interestingly, Phil didn't grow up in a fighting family. He got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at 14 years of age for a pretty typical reason. He was getting bullied at school and he wanted to defend himself. But he was naturally gifted, tearing through grappling tournaments and eventually transitioning to pro mixed martial arts in 2009. He was big, 6'4" with a massive reach, and he used it to drag guys to the mat and, for lack of a better term, crush them. He racked up an undefeated regional record and he got the call that every fighter dreams of, the UFC. But this is where the dream turned into an absolute nightmare. Being honest, on paper, his UFC run from 2011 to 2013 was a disaster. He went 2-3 and got cut. He suffered brutal, fast knockouts against guys like Stipe Miocic in 43 seconds and a staggering 19-second knockout against Matt Mitrione. Fans and analysts wrote him off. They slapped him with one of the hardest to lose labels in combat sports, and that is a gym fighter. Basically, it's someone who looks fantastic in sparring, but completely folds under the lights because they lack heart, or unluckily for some people because it's pretty much genetic, a chin. Or in non-combat sports lingo, the ability to take a punch. But the critics had it completely wrong. Phil wasn't lacking heart. He was a true warrior, and he was fighting a war in his own head. Because Phil was suffering from severe, undiagnosed clinical anxiety. Fighting requires a cold, predatory focus, but Phil's baseline at the time was pure, paralysing terror. He didn't even know what anxiety was. He just thought the crushing dread he felt every single day, even from just making a phone call, was something that was normal. By the time he made the walk to the octagon, his adrenaline was completely in the depths of the sewers, completely dumped. And inside the cage, his brain went straight into a panicked flight mode rather than fight mode. He later actually admitted that his heavy grappling strategy back then wasn't actually tactical. He was just terrified to throw a punch because he thought he'd get knocked out. So he'd just grab guys out of a pure primal drive to survive. So when the UFC cut him in 2013, Phil's life spiraled out of control. He bounced around promotions in Japan, in Russia, and the UK, winning some, getting stopped in others. But outside of the cage, things were getting really dark because the undiagnosed anxiety became so overwhelming that he turned to drugs and alcohol in copious amounts just to cope. And his fear morphed into severe OCD. He was living what he has since called an insane life, checking door locks dozens of times before leaving the house, even installing surveillance cameras in his bedroom because he was consumed by a paranoid fear that somebody was going to break in and steal his dog. It got to the point where he was dealing with consistent and constant suicidal thoughts. He felt trapped in a mind that was constantly manufacturing the worst case scenarios. Ironically though, Phil had actually worked as a professional drugs counsellor before making it big in MMA. So he knew the mechanics of addiction and trauma, but he couldn't fix his own brain chemistry. But then in 2017, everything changed. Like so many things, good and bad, with a simple web search. A desperate Phil had typed in irrational fear of everything into Google. And the results all pointed to clinical anxiety. He finally had a name for the monster in the room. He went to a psychiatrist, he got prescribed medication, and within 3 months, the fog had lifted. That dread that had choked him since childhood just disappeared. But finally getting the right medication didn't just save Phil's life. It unlocked his true potential as a fighter. Once his brain wasn't consumed by panic 24/7, his fight IQ skyrocketed. He could actually see punches coming, he could time his takedowns properly, and he could manage his cardio. He signed with KSW in 2018, won the vacant heavyweight title in his first fight, and he hasn't looked back since. He's turned into a methodical, suffocating grappler who routinely logs over 23 minutes of control time in a 25-minute fight. And if you want definitive proof of how much his mindset changed, just look at what happened when he rematched Todd Duffy at KSW 79. Now bear in mind, this was one of the exact guys who had knocked him out badly back in the UFC days. But this time Phil didn't panic. He calmly walked Duffy down and knocked him out in the very first round to retain his belt. It was complete, poetic closure on his past trauma. To stay at this level, he trains regularly with Tom Aspinall, the UFC heavyweight champ, and that keeps his striking defence sharp, but he's also on the mat daily with rising UFC heavyweight Mick Parkin. And Parkin has flat out said that Phil is physically the strongest human he's ever encountered, with an absolutely immovable base and a crushing top pressure. And if you think about it, right, when an active UFC heavyweight is calling you the strongest guy he knows, it tells you everything you need to know about his pedigree. So, why is Phil de Vries not a household name in the UK? And it's got nothing to do with his Dutch ancestry, hence the strange surname. Well, jokes aside, his style isn't the most fan-friendly. It's not really one for the casual fan, but certainly one for the purist. And that might explain his lack of commercial breakthrough back in England. Plus, there's some stuff that's well outside of his control. A well-funded but niche Scandinavian streaming platform called Viaplay bought the rights a few years ago, but they totally pulled out of the UK market in I think 2025. Now, British fans have to buy a standalone digital pay-per-view to watch him, which most casual fans just won't do. Well, they might, actually, and I'll be going into that in a future video. Waiting for your call, Mr. Lewandowski. Not the footballer, the owner of KSW. The UK MMA scene is dominated by the UFC and loud, trash-talking American personalities, right? Phil is a total opposite. He's a quiet, self-deprecating guy who explicitly says he just fights for the cash to support his family. He's very, very open about his mental health and his reliance on medication. In Poland, they love his respectful, sort of stoic warrior vibe. But for all the reasons I laid out, it's not quite carried over to England. But it's incredibly rare to see someone in combat sports be this vulnerable. And not just doing it because it looks good, mentioning no names. And Phil, mate, if you watch this, And you probably hear this a lot, but I just want to say it's genuinely really brave to do what you've done and speak so openly about depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and all of that stuff, really. Because I think when a pop star or an actor says they're suffering from mental health stuff, it's easy for people who, maybe go to fancy dinner parties to identify with them and relate. But the guy on a building site or, in a call centre or whatever, they probably don't. But you, my mate, your job is a professional fighter. You quite literally get locked into a cage and fight other blokes, big ones. It doesn't really get much more stereotypically macho than that, right? So for someone like you to speak so candidly, I think it's a great thing, man. I think it's a great thing, and in a way, it's like doubly brave in your position because your opponents could use it against you in press conferences and things like that. So it takes an extraordinary amount of courage to go ahead and do it anyway, and I think you're awesome for doing it. But Phil isn't just a great ambassador for men's mental health. He's still sitting on the throne at 40 years old. And from the looks of it, from where I'm sitting, he isn't slowing down. And I think it's because his style relies on grappling, heavy grappling, and avoiding damage from strikes to the head, right? His career lifespan's been longer than the guys who just stand and trade punches. It's smart, really. And he's now aiming for 20 title defences. Pretty cool. As for what's next in late 2026, well, the debate is officially over. Just last week, KSW announced that Phil is defending his belt in a rematch against the legitimate number one contender, Stefan Vojčák. So, it's happening on September 21st in the Czech Republic at KSW 121. So, Phil actually beat this guy back in 2025. But Vojčák just last month destroyed a top kickboxer in KSW, Arek Vojčák, to become the undeniable number one contender again. So a rematch does make all the sense in the world for KSW. And as a result, it is locked in. But looking past Vojčák, there's still the money fight on the horizon. The spectacle. After a recent win, Phil actually grabbed the mic and he called out Eddie Hall. Yeah, that Eddie Hall. The former World's Strongest Man Eddie Hall. And the thing is, Eddie actually made his MMA debut last year, but he didn't just beat some random guy. He actually beat Mariusz Pudzianowski, also a fellow World's Strongest Man winner and an absolute legend in KSW as well. Phil even offered to do a gentleman's agreement to change the rules, drop in the grappling even, or shortening the rounds just to get Eddie Hall in the cage. So between defending against the absolute legitimate number one contender in a high stakes match for the purists and plotting a massive low risk, high reward cash out against the world's strongest man, Phil DeFries has already cemented his legacy, at least in my opinion. Because he didn't just beat the guys locked in the cage with him, he beat the demons in his own head. And that makes him one of the most remarkable heavyweight champions in MMA we've ever seen. But like always, what do you guys think? With the right marketing, could he have been a bigger star in Britain? Is there still chance if he beats Eddie Hall? Or, on the flip side, do you think he maybe prefers being a normal bloke at home and a star abroad in Poland where you can kind of pick and choose your stardom a little bit? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.